The vicious circle of debt can be particularly detrimental for countries like Egypt, where efforts to stimulate growth often rely on accumulating loans. As these nations seek to invest in economic projects and social programs, they turn to international lenders for financial support. However, the changing financial conditions, including fluctuating interest rates and external economic pressure, can exacerbate the situation. As debt mounts, countries may find themselves trapped, where the cost of servicing existing loans limits their ability to invest in growth initiatives or comply with climate objectives. This accumulation of debt not only stifles economic progress, but can also affect the welfare of the people. To break free from this cycle, collaboration among various stakeholders is essential. Traditional debtor organizations like the IMF, World Bank, along with emerging debtor countries such as China, must work together to develop sustainable solutions. The involvement of the indebted countries themselves is equally crucial. Addressing the debt issue requires a collective effort to acknowledge the unique challenges faced by nations like Egypt. This session aims to explore pragmatic, effective, and fair ways for indebted countries to regain financial sovereignty, enabling them to overcome debt constraints and build a more equitable future.
All right, so I'm also happy. I thought initially that the discussion of the topic called debt is really heavy, especially when it comes at the end of the day. However, I felt relieved when I realized that it's not that heavy. As a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, if you were at the Al-Masri Al-Yom's event, and today, if you were in the session where His Excellency Amr Moussa spoke, there is a much bigger and a much worse and a much heavier topic that's called, we live in a world of crisis, and worse yet, we have no one to manage it. So when someone tells you that the world is messed up as such, you have an environmental crisis, you have a global governance and rebalancing, and God knows who is going to end up standing. Most of us probably will not be standing. And then when you have an economy, a global economy, where only Elon Musk of the world have what they need and the rest of us do not, well, that's a tough order. So anyway, I felt so good about discussing the public debt rather than discussing the global political, geopolitical conflicts and crises and all sorts of things. So the good news keep coming. Now, before I get into the substance and introduce the substance and frame the topic of today, I want to thank ABLA and ECS for initiating that forum. I think it's a fantastic thing to have something called Cairo Forum, and it's an annual event, and it puts Egypt on the map, in the map of the think tank, or the world of think tanks. I think it's something that's really good, and I am sure the next one will be equally as good as this one, at least the beginning of this one. Now, debt. What is that story about vicious circle? What makes it a vicious circle? The starting point is that developing countries nowadays want to actually grow a little faster, benefit their people. They need money. Where would the money come from? The trouble is, domestic savings are low. The needs for investment are high. There is a saving investment gap. The money has to come from somebody else's pocket. They borrow as one form of mobilizing some savings, right? Now, they go and put developing countries, put their money in all sorts of things. When they put their money in projects that don't generate enough returns on the money that they borrowed, they get stuck. In no time, they find themselves with a big stock of public debt, with limited resources. They probably resort to the IMF to help them out. And the IMF, actually, according to Jeff Sachs, not me, so blame it on him, is really interested in making sure that the borrowers, the lenders get their money. Whether the people of the country are carrying a heavy burden or not, that's a different story. I'm trying to get you to be thinking about what's yet to come your way. The trouble is that they give them money, but money to do what? To actually pay for the cost of the loans that they accumulated before. And then we keep going in that vicious circle. Saving investment gap, you borrow, you put your money not necessarily in projects that with high returns, you need to borrow more, and then the cost of borrowing, ask the Minister of Finance, how much does he have to pay out of his budget to serve the debt? It's really a tricky situation. Now, the next step, we know what the problem is. Let's go back and ask ourselves, what are the possible ways out? And this is where Mr. Kujuk comes in. I have three theories. One of them I call the Shakespeare theory. In Hamlet, and Professor Adel Bishai is very fond of Shakespeare and plays, and he's going to quote us back. But anyway, he has a sentence that goes like this: neither a borrower nor a lender be. The rest of it, I don't remember exactly, but essentially the idea is that you're going to end up losing your friend, your money, and possibly your husbandry, family husbandry. All right? Well, that's not a very good strategy. What is the alternative strategy? The alternative strategy, I call it the Plato strategy. And the Plato strategy is a world that's so idealistic. It's a world where the global governance guys have big heart, and they're going to give you debt forgiveness, and they are going to give you cheap money for nothing. And they are going to, when you are stuck somewhere, they're going to hold your hand and bring you up. Well, that world, Plato is dead long time ago, and he remains to be dead. So that theory is not likely to be the one that you're going to encounter. So what are we left with? My third theory, which is Ahmed Kujuk's theory. That is, a Minister of Finance has to pay his dues, but also he looks for ways to get out of the problem. Our session now is really about how do you go about it the Ahmed Kujuk's way? That is, how do you grow your economy such that you lower your percentage of debt to the economy? How do you restructure your debt such that you get loans at lower prices? How do you put your money in a place where it's going to give you much higher reward than you did in the past? You need to learn, right? If you didn't do it right the first time, you might just as well learn over time and do it better next time. That is what I call the Ahmed Kujuk's way. My questions to my panelists, we have a cast of fantastic panelists. My questions to them are going to go in 2 rounds, and I'm not going to allow deviations from the questions that I'm suggesting. One of them has to deal with, essentially you have a stock of debt problem, and then the second one has to do with the flow of debt. And I want to divide the 2 rounds of the questions around these 2 ideas. The first idea is, at this point in time, developing countries, Egypt including, are stuck with a high stock of debt. Using the Ahmed Kujuk theory, how would you go about that? That is really the first question. The second question that I'm going to ask you, I'm telling you beforehand so that there are no surprises. After we go through a first round answering that question, I'm going to come back asking you, what is it that you need to do to prevent the debt problem from coming back haunting you? Basically, it's a question of the flow of, what safeguards do you need to put in place? What kind of rationality do you want to adopt? What kind of institutional arrangements? What kind of ceilings do you want to impose? Whatever. I'm just giving you clues. But of course, you guys know about it much better than I do. Now, why am I saying that we have a fantastic panel? I'm not gratuitous. I only say things when I mean them. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we have among our panelists representatives of all sorts of types. We have the IMF guy, who is going to tell us, you messed it up. You pay for it. It's your problem. I don't know whether you're going to say that or not. But anyway, we have the guardian, guardian angel of the lenders sitting on the podium. That is one type. And then we have at the other end, Ahmed Kujuk, who is the guy who gets the money. He's the borrower. He is the guy who has to suffer paying the cost of doing it. And then we have the independent intellectuals. That's you have the broker. He turned out to be a broker. I was gonna describe him as the independent intellectual person on the podium. And then we have Mahmoud Muhyiddin, who is all of them in one. He has been on the government side. He has been on the IMF side. He has also been a professor of economics at the Cairo University throughout his life until now. So we have, you name it. So I was not joking when I said that we have a great set of panelists. And I'm going to go about it within the first round by asking the first question, which has to do with the stock. Most developing countries worldwide are stock. You can give whatever reasons you want, pandemic, the war, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is you have a big stock hanging over the heads and the shoulders of developing countries. IMF, tell us, how would you help developing countries deal with that? Sir, floor is yours.
You hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. We at the IMF aspire to be guardians of the people, not guardians of lenders.
Music to my ear.
But let me share with you some of the things that I have learned in my career at the IMF, always working with countries that had high debt levels, sometimes high stocks of debt that are sustainable. But I've also worked in countries that actually defaulted on their on the debt because the debt was unsustainable. In particular, the cases of Republic of Congo and Zambia. So when you ask about the stock issue, I think we need to separate two different cases. One case where the debt is high, but is still deemed to be sustainable. In other words, the authorities are capable of putting together a program of economic reforms that will maintain the sustainability of debt and be able to pay its debt obligations. It may be difficult, it may be challenging, but the debt is assessed to be sustainable. And we have to differentiate this case from cases where the debt has become unsustainable. And this is largely a technical exercise that we do with country authorities, looking at your growth rate, looking at the stock of debt, and looking especially at the type of fiscal consolidation that is economically and socially feasible. And I want to emphasize this third point, because when I joined the IMF in 2001, we were looking at debt sustainability largely, in my experience, as a mathematical exercise. We would look, this is the stock of debt, this is what we think the country needs to do, this is the magnitude, and this is the speed, and this is the composition of the adjustment. And yes, we would worry a little bit about growth, because we know that when fiscal consolidation is large, that can affect growth. But in retrospect, we realized that, in fact, we kind of underestimated the impact of this fiscal consolidation has on growth. That, you know, when there's a large fiscal adjustment, it tends to depress growth. So this is an area where we had to develop more awareness that, and our research department did some studies about this. We call it the fiscal multiplier. The second question that, frankly, when I started my career at the IMF, we were not really focusing on was the impact of fiscal consolidation on social sectors, on social spending. Countries were advised to implement a specific fiscal consolidation program. Here's the magnitude, here's the speed. And we didn't really pay attention to the impact that this could have on social sectors. And we were criticized because, in the end, countries facing these needs for large adjustments ended up having no other alternative than cut also critical social programs with a bad impact on poverty and inequality. So over time, I think we have become much more aware, and I'm speaking still about cases where that is sustainable. We have become much more aware of the impact that fiscal consolidation can have on growth and on the social dimension. This is why we try to calibrate the magnitude. Well, does it need to be 3.3% of GDP, or can it be a little bit less? Of course, country authorities will always tell us that we are a little bit biased towards the large part of the adjustment, and it tends to happen. Does it need to be so large? The speed is important, and often we had unrealistic expectations of, we want to see the debt come down quickly. So in 3 years, we want to see the deficit come down. And that speed may be mathematically optimal in some sort of research paper, but behind a country there are authorities that face real choices and real trade-offs. So looking also at the speed, at the appropriate speed, is important. And the composition, what do you do with the composition? Do you focus more on revenues? In some countries, for example, Egypt has potential to collect some more revenues. In other countries, we found, for example, that some expenditure lines require some adjustment, subsidies or wages. So it's important to look at these three things: getting the magnitude right, getting the speed and the composition correctly, and especially emphasizing, to the extent possible, finding a package that protects social spending. So that's about fiscal consolidation. Unfortunately, if your level of debt is high, it's very difficult to avoid fiscal consolidation as part of the solution. The second thing is, it's important in our view. It's also something that we probably neglected 20 years ago. The importance of reforms. When you have a dialogue with countries, it's not just about the numbers, but again, it's what other reforms can this country introduce or follow to support growth? What are the reforms in the business environment? What are the reforms in institutions that can support private sector growth? Because at the end of the day, if a country doesn't grow, the fiscal consolidation is not going to succeed, because the growth will be low, revenues will be low, and you might end up in the category of the countries where debt has become unsustainable. So important to emphasize reforms. And a third component is the role of fiscal institutions. And we find it's very important that countries strengthen their fiscal institutions. Sometimes that may mean having a fiscal rule where you express clearly, over the medium term, we intend our debt level to be a specific percent of GDP, or we are targeting an overall fiscal or primary balance of a specific amount. These rules are important if they are followed, and of course, rules also have difficulties. They need to have some flexibility and escape clauses, but they are useful because they present a commitment of rigor that can help authorities increase their credibility over time. Now, despite all that, in some cases, you just come to the conclusion that there is no feasible program of economic reforms and fiscal consolidation that can make your debt sustainable. This was the case of Zambia when I was the mission chief for Zambia. It was the case of the Republic of Congo when I was the mission chief. It just didn't work out. You did the math. It was not possible to suggest a level of adjustment that would have destroyed the country. It would basically, you have to slash the budget in half. That's not possible. And when that happens, it becomes very complicated, because we at the IMF, we have to be neutral. It's a dialogue between the country authorities and the lenders, and we can facilitate the dialogue with our analysis on debt sustainability to share with the country authorities. In fact, we work with them also on the technical assessment of what we think would be feasible in terms of adjustment and in terms of debt relief. In that context, I think several principles are helpful to help in those cases. One is the principle of transparency. Often lenders are going to be suspicious about requests for debt relief when they don't have access to information. What is the composition of this debt? Who are these loans owed to? For what types of projects? It's very important to show transparency about your debt stock and publish the information. That is going to give some comfort to the lenders that they know what is being restructured. The other principle, I think, is burden sharing. There's always going to be some tension between the sovereign creditors, the private sector creditors, different types of countries. They all want to perceive that the authorities are treating them fairly, that they are all, that nobody is providing debt relief to pay another creditor. So this is also a crucial point. The other point that we learned over time, and this is thanks to the work of some of my colleagues at the IMF, in particular Jeremy Zettelmeyer and Jan Liu, who's now the general counsel, is that once this determination of debt problem has been made, that debt isn't sustainable, it's important not to procrastinate, because countries are often reluctant to start the process or continue, because there is this reputational risk associated with it. But once that has happened, once the technical analysis has been done, it's important to proceed quickly, because these processes take time. It can take 2 or 3 years to complete the process. Another difficulty that we often find is the question of coordination. As I was mentioning earlier in my career, when we were dealing with countries with a high level of debt, there was a coordinating mechanism in the Paris Club and the HIPing initiative. Now it's more complicated because countries have more diverse debt with financial markets, with different players. There is a framework, the G20 common framework, that is beginning to produce some results, but it's more difficult than in the old times. So I think, just to sum up, I think it's important to separate the two cases. If a country can provide a credible economic reform package, it's always better to avoid a default. But even when that package is there, it's important to get the magnitude of the adjustment right, protecting social spending, having some program to generate growth for the private sector, and building your institutions. And if that doesn't work and you end up in a case of default, then it's going to be more difficult. But there are some countries that are beginning to succeed.
Well, thank you very much. What you really have told us is that, well, anytime anyone is undertaking lending anybody else, there is a risk involved. And when things don't work out, what the IMF is telling us, from what you have just told me, is that it's really the country who would pay the full price of that risk, but not the lender. Is that correct? Basically, you told us about an adjustment program, a reform program that will put you on the right track. You told us that you had a bigger heart in the process of doing that repeatedly in different countries, and you decided you want to worry about the social impact of your reform. But you have not said anything about why is it that the creditors shouldn't pay part of the cost of taking a risk in a given country, right? So I'm still feeling that the recipe you have given us is actually a good one. It's correct. I mean, this is what countries have to do. They have to put together a program that will put them on the right path. And if that involves fiscal consolidation and monetary policy adjustment and worrying about the social side, this is a perfectly sensible way of thinking about it. But what it doesn't deal with, in my mind, is the fact that who is carrying the risk and why, who is paying for things when they go wrong. And my book says that the two parties have to be part of it. If I lend someone and I don't do the right assessment of the capacity of that person to pay me back, then I took the wrong decision. But I end up actually not paying any cost. I just run away with my money. So you guys are still protecting the lenders, not the borrowers. Now, I'm going to move on to the minister, because he's on the other side. He's the one who is getting the money from you. Let's see how he is dealing with the stock problem and what is his take on the fact that the IMF is unfair and making you pay for all their mistakes and everybody else's mistakes. Is that a fair question? No. You can refrain, you know, you can plead the Fifth Amendment, you know. Go ahead, please. I'm delighted you're here so that you can respond to the IMF and to everybody else.
It's a lovely Saturday.
I am trying to, these people are going to fall asleep.
Yes.
So my job is to make sure that we all stay very, very awake. Am I succeeding so far?
Excellent.
Good. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Mason.
You're doing great, really. I to the extent that I want to give you more time, even my time to speak, but it will be not very well perceived. So I will have to say something. But I mean, it's my first time today. Of course, if, we had the cabinet meeting. If I didn't have the cabinet meeting, I would have spent the full day. It's lovely to have this type of discussions, this type of invitees, this great work. So Cairo Forum also is a wonderful name. So congratulations. I heard about this idea a few months ago, but now it's a reality. And I'm sure it will be a great success and hopefully also a very sustainable one. So great to be here. And it's lovely also to be in this panel with the great people around me. And also Dr. Mahmoud with us. I don't know where exactly you are, but yesterday we're speaking here in Cairo, so I'm not sure where you are, but you are somewhere. I mean, so great to have you. I will say few things about Egypt, but very because of the also the role I'm playing, so it's important to say something about that. But let me before that, maybe for the audience, I want to say few numbers. It's important to share this in a global context. I'm talking about developing countries at large, emerging countries, and Egypt, of course, as one of those countries and a country that has to do a lot of things to improve the debt situation. But let me tell you a couple of things. Those are official data by UNCTAD or by the IMF or the entities that responsible for compiling and publishing public debt data. In general, from 2010 till 2023, so in almost 13 years, public debt increased from 51 trillion to almost 100 trillion, so doubled. That's a rate of growth that we didn't see almost in all previous decades. So this is the one, that the stock itself is increasing significantly. The second important observation, that the rate of growth of public debt has been twice faster in developing countries than in advanced economies. So public debt is growing very fast, but the rate of growth in the developing countries is growing twice faster than the rate of growth in advanced economies. Yes, they might have a bigger stock, but the growth rate of the developing countries is double advanced economies. So it's an important also point to keep in mind. Now, 1/3 of global public debt creditors is really with developing countries. So it's becoming even a bigger share than in the past. Public debt is growing in all regions, but only in Africa that is growing faster than the GDP. And there should be something done there. When we do any stabilization or think, I'm saying those numbers because I will come back to say my views. That's important. So in Africa, that is growing faster than GDP, and it's a very terrible situation. It's a very difficult situation because it simply means that the borrowing is not creating enough resources for the future to repay. Basically, debt is growing faster than the GDP is growing. I find something very interesting. When I was reading more about, not for this, but in general for this, but in general, when I was reading more about after World War II, there was this London agreement where it was putting some sort of the Marshall Plan and supporting Germany at that time. And I found in the agreement said a statement saying that Germany cannot pay more than 5% for external debt, 5% from its export proceeds to external debt. So there was a sensible way of also trying to figure a way for the country to be sensible, to be growing, to be recovering, while also putting some ceiling, but there was a very sensible number there. I want to say a couple of also important things before I move to Egypt and talk more about. So this is also important indicator. One thing that is very interesting also, that the creditors have changed. Maybe when Dr. Ahmed was a very important economist at the World Bank and was looking at those issues, the creditor base was different. Now, for developing countries, 61% of public debt of those countries, of developing countries, is due for the private creditors and not for MDBs. And this is a big change. It's not anymore that most of the debt is with the IMF or the World Bank or other African Development Bank, and the rest, 61% is with private creditors, is with creditors that invest in bonds of the emerging markets or other private creditors that banks and others, international banks. So it's very important. Now, even if we have a big heart or a bigger heart on the MDBs, maybe it's not enough. We need a bigger heart elsewhere also. So, but this is important also. Also, on the debt service, which I will just mention the number, but I will refrain from giving some ideas now, maybe for later. But also, the amount of interest payment the developing countries are paying every year is almost 850 billion. And in Africa, the debt service per capita is at $70, while the education per capita is 60, and for health, it's 39. So in Africa, we're borrowing, but at a faster rate than the GDP, and we're paying more on that service than we're paying on human capital and basic issues. So it's not a nice situation, and it's a very bad one. And if we really want to do something for Egypt, for Africa, for a lot of other countries in the developing world, this also need to be very inclusive and comprehensive, because it's not about the problem with that, in my point of view, and now switching a bit to Egypt. The problem was that before putting solutions, before putting any adjustment, before putting any plan, I think there is two important things that I really believe in. First, that sustainability is a very technical issue, but actually, it's also, there is no right and wrong. It's a lot of indicators. It's about the composition. It's about the length of the debt. It's about the type of creditors. It's about the level. It's about the potential of the country. It's a lot of things. And it's very hard to have a very significant or a very clear benchmark saying that here you fit there. Or it's also about the sophistication of your institution, sophistication of your market. It's about the origin of the problem, where it's coming. So it's a lot of things. And the second issue is that I cannot, from experience, from a very applied experience, not from a theoretical experience, but from very applied experience, not from studies, it's impossible to do a debt adjustment and succeed if the economy is not growing. It's impossible. Yes, it needs recalibrating. It needs to rethink about it. If the economy is not growing, we cannot say that we said and we committed that in 3 years we have to have this debt level, and so we have to commit to that. We have to have a dynamic exercise, because it means that something is not working, especially if the private sector is suffering, which should be the engine of growth. So if the private sector is not doing well, if it's not able to create enough jobs, if not, then there is something wrong. And there is no way to ignore that or to push that. And thirdly, adjustments that I fully agree with what was mentioned. Adjustments and sensible ones. Sometimes the problem would be that you have a creditor in a program or in an agreement, and the agreement has a deadline. But the country doesn't have a deadline. It's much more, it has a bigger time horizon. So it's very difficult sometimes in those type of agreements that, of course, the creditor want to have the biggest achievement during this timeline because you have an agreement. So it's always also a problem. It creates a problem because maybe it's more sensible to do the same issue, but over 5 years, but not over 3 years. So this is a problem that I just mentioning, and it's a problem that we need to think about for Egypt and for others, how to build this to have the same sensible adjustment in terms of speed, in terms of size, but also time can be a way of creating things. But the problem then is the agreement and the timing of the agreement. But now coming back more to Egypt. So in Egypt case, I think how to deal with the debt level and the debt stock and how to reduce it. And I think I cannot repeat it better, but I cannot think of any other way except first of all to ensure that the economy is growing back by the private sector at a decent level. And if you can achieve this and make sure that the economy is growing and picking, then big part, not all, but a big part of your problem is starting to be resolved. It will help you tremendously, but it has to be a real source of growth. It has to be a source of growth that is more sustainable, that's coming from real sectors and from sectors that is very important. So this is, to me, key. This is why even we have an IMF program, we have commitments, but it does not exclude that we as authorities should also maybe identify new priorities. And that's what we did. We did, and by the way, it doesn't have to be against what we have committed to. It might be complementary. We said one key priority, we will do tax reforms that is key for the business community, that's key for building trust. And that will bring us more money, by the way, than doing only the standard way of thinking of raising here or putting more burden. I believe that this will be a very important source for dealing with the debt problem. But and I think when I explained the rationale for my colleagues, not only at the fund, at the World Bank, at others, with even private investors that we meet, bondholders, I think there was a lot of, at the beginning, there was a bit of, to be very frank, there was some sort of engagement built on a personal trust, not based on the story they are hearing. But when you explain it more, when they hear it more, when they get a sense about how the potential of this for the country, for the private sector, for everybody, there was much more engagement and much more acceptance. So I think definitely we need a growing economy. But this is not enough. We need also to be smart and we need to be more proactive. And I think my second point is that for that to have a sustainable, credible, declining path, it needs to be dealt at a very elevated level. It needs to be a national priority. It needs to be everyone priority because everyone will benefit from it. The private sector will benefit from lower cost of borrowing. The private sector will benefit from a much more resources available for them to expand and explore. The risk premium will be lower. More people will be willing to come and invest and co-invest in the country. The government definitely will benefit for a lot of reasons. And the future generations will benefit. So it needs to be elevated and it needs to be dealt at the highest level. And this is what I'm trying to do now. Trying to say that this is not only a Ministry of Finance. Yes, definitely Ministry of Finance has to play a bigger role, but it's everybody interest. My third point is that we need to be proactive and use all tools. One good thing that we did recently, and we put the rule before it happened, by the way, is also, let's also use one-offs. Let's use divestiture programs. Let's use selling a piece of land or asset here or there. Let's use this proceed very wisely. and let's make use of this proceeds to reduce debt significantly. It helped us tremendously last year when we used this money that came from Ras Al Hikmah. 50% of it we got it, but we did a very smart thing, because if we did any use of this money that is not, unfortunately, according to the standards of everybody else outside, we would have been penalized for no good reason. They would have told us that you're not able to pay your debt, and that this is a debt restructuring, and then you will end in a different story, because it's very difficult. They have just very strict rules and no justification behind it, I think. And this is something that I'm raising because it needs to change. But anyway, what we did is different. We got the money. We knew the money was coming. And that was a big debate with the IMF, for example, about the TFA, about we were anticipating this money, but we didn't do the typical way. We kept it. When that was retiring, we paid it, but we didn't reissue. We didn't issue new debt. So the bottom line, we did the same, but in a market-oriented way, so that people, creditor, private creditor, markets give us the tick mark. It could have been done differently. Same outcome, by the way, but we had to. I'm saying that because also for people who are hearing us, developing countries need also to have the capacity, because it's not a fair word. There are rules, and you have to also play against. So this is the third thing that we need to do. Use exceptional one-offs, use as much as possible stimulus or accelerators that can give signals that you are dealing with the problem and that it seems that to be a priority. And then the fourth thing, you need to also be very innovative. That for nature is important. This is something that I believe there is a bigger role for everybody to play. There is debt, and there is commitment by the advanced economies for developing countries that is not happening and will not happen. And we keep asking that they are not making the commitment. And this is an argument that is nice to hear it every year. And we'll keep hearing it. And I don't think anything will do anything with it. So one thing is to change the situation and say, okay, you are not putting new commitments. We have commitment to you. Let's make something of good use in that regard. So instead of paying you back, let us put this into a new investment that fits the global agenda. Let's put this new investment in doing something good to reduce carbon emission, to do more sustainable outcomes, to improve health or education. And I think this can be a very, very solid way of thinking. It can be a lot of other things. It can be turning some deposits or liabilities or loans into something. Can be something big, because this is a much more possible way. It's much more credible way, and it will not create a lot of problems. So I'll stop here. I have a lot of other issues, but I will stop here for now.
Thank you very much. Actually, I feel a little better. And I'm not as worried as before. So that's good. I know that you didn't, you just told the IMF, take a little more time and take it easy a little bit, and that kind of, but you didn't tell them anything beyond that. So that's being very nice to everybody. I'm going to go to Professor Brony. Brony, right?
Yeah, the broker.
Yeah, Brony. And he described himself as the broker. Let's see how he's going to play that role between the two of them. And he's not in the middle by accident. It's all designed. So, Professor, floor is yours.
The broker is going to be boring, because given the time. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and best wishes for the future of this yearly Cairo Forum. The way I will sort of get out from the trap is to place the issue at a global level. I have a few specific recipes for the individual country, etc. But let me consider the debt problem a global problem. And by the way, I have some difficulties to take away my country from the. So it's a global problem. And the global problem should be tackled with the right global governance. And we don't have this. We are in a tremendous moment from the point of view of the governance of the politics and of the global economy. We have wars, we have all sorts of problems. We have our international organizations do not work politically as they should. They have fantastic technicians, but the decision-making is blocked by a lot of diplomatic issues. And this happens at the United Nations, but also at the IMF, for what I understand. So let me tell you that for me, a solution to this, if you want, it's a public, it's a global public good that we are looking for, financial soundness. And you cannot pursue this global public good without a good governance of the world. Among the indispensable building blocks of this global governance, there's what I like to call the global South, and forget about the BRICS. I like the global South, possibly ex-China. And the global South is crucial, both because it's highly indebted, at least in many of its protagonists, and second, because it's a new protagonist of the global diplomacy. And this growing diplomatic profile of the global South could be helpful to approach the global debt problem. And let me also say that the European Union could be helpful in sort of leveraging on the global South to form an alliance which makes very serious proposals and very implementable proposals to change important aspect of the global governance by breaking this tremendous situation where you have the two blocks, call them as you prefer, the democratic and the autocratic, the East and the West and the rest, the goods and the bads, the US and China, etc. Call it as you prefer, but we cannot stand other 10 years of this tremendous way of looking at the world. We have to break this thing in all issues, and the financial issues are among those that we might tackle also with technical methods. So I think my idea on the governance issues is that the EU should start a diplomatic initiative, very strong. I mean, in some sense, we have started because we have hosted the Global South, for instance, at the G7 with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of involvement. We are trying to show all the possible interest for the Global South, but we should be even more proactive and also smart and also united. The problem is that the European Union is not that united. And so when we speak, we are not so credible because we don't have one single voice. But perhaps by making an exercise on these global topics, we could find it. A second observation that I would make as a broker is that, we have to admit that for both borrowers and lenders, the incentives to encourage over-borrowing and over-lending are there. the benefits from borrowing appear immediate to governments in particular, but sometimes also to the private sector. While the costs of servicing the debts appear in the medium term, and this creates an incentive to overborrow. But lenders also overlend, and they overlend because, well, they can immediately cash the profitability of their loans, and this is particularly true for private lenders, obviously, while the risks of default are in the medium-long term. And this is well known. And sometimes the IMF-guided debt distress solutions tend to overprotect lenders' interests so that they sort of reinforce this propensity to borrow, to lend, I'm sorry. To correct these incentive structures, we need some measures. And, well, these measures would count especially for avoiding future excesses in debt, but they can also help to deal with the legacy problem by benefiting the sustainability of existing debt. So I don't want to criticize what our moderator has set as a rule. I mean, there are differences between dealing with the existing debt and looking at the future, but there is also a big linkage, because if you convince the market that you are well organized to avoid excesses in the future, the sustainability of your existing debt will increase. So I think that some of the constraints that the IMF or the European Union puts to indebtedness are useful also for existing debts. I don't want to be long, so let me just list some sort of technical aspects that can deal with the legacy of existing over-indebtedness. Some of them have already been mentioned. Well, we need several innovations can be considered besides, obviously, the bilateral, multilateral concessional financial supports. They can also always help, obviously. To improve that restructuring and rescheduling opportunities, well, first of all, we have to coordinate and coordinate also with China, because without a good coordination with China's credit, there's no solution to the overall problem. The radical measure would be to create a sovereign debt authority. Let me recall this idea that Anne Kruger proposed in 2002 and was killed at the IMF. I was there for some reason, and I was just frightened by the violence with which the US government, in particular, being backed by US banks, basically killed the proposal. And this is something that should be taken out of the box and discussed again. But then you have, in the meantime, a lot of smaller things to do. New coordinated legislations could encourage, for instance, private creditor participation in debt workouts. This is crucial, because otherwise it's a matter of codifying the duties of creditors to cooperate in debt restructuring, for instance. You have to oblige them to enter in restructuring and not acting as a blocker, to enhance collective action mechanism, immunizing sovereign debtor assets from seizure when the debtor is involved in an orderly debt restructuring process. If the debtor gets involved in an orderly debt restructuring process, there should be some premium on the existing debt. You can subsidize and facilitate asset swaps. And you mentioned it, where existing credits can be transformed in globally desirable ways, like rechanneling funds towards financing of climate actions, for instance. So there are a lot of technical innovations or reinforcement, but we have to do something because the figures are terrible. And I end up by saying my little figures that are really figures from the IMF. Middle East and North African countries, debt servicing costs jumped from an average of around 0.5 of GDP during the 10 years preceding the pandemic to nearly 2% in 2024. So they were multiplied by 4. In South Asian countries, the jump was from less than 2% to around 3%. In sub-Saharan Africa, from about 1% to more than 2%. According to the World Bank Global Economic Prospects, about half of the world's poorest countries are either in debt distress or in a high risk of distress. Debt service costs also limit the possibility for many countries of developing their own climate actions, etc. So it's a terrible situation, and we have to do something.
We have to do something about it. Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin is going to do something about it. And since I said earlier that he represents all angles, Mahmoud, we are all ears. Please go ahead. And I'm sorry for keeping you at the end. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Galal. Excellent moderation, and I'm very much happy with the structure that you put at the beginning. Cannot solve the problem today without really getting some strong links between the stock and the flow. So I read it that way as well when Professor Bruni reacted to the structure. Very pleased as well with the comments made earlier by my good friend Alex. And I share your relative comfort, Dr. Galal, after listening to the minister. He's up to date, not just of what should be done, but basically with the international dynamics and the benchmarks, including the famous 5% rule that was suggested and applied after the Second World War for debt service as a ratio to the receivables. And actually this very ratio was almost our benchmark, without really going to the German example, for many years after resolving the Egyptian debt problem after the Gulf crisis with the famous IRSAP and the Paris Club. But today is different, and for reasons mentioned by all of the three speakers, we are not in 1990, we are not in 2000, we are not even in 2015, when the Finance for Development framework was suggested. But perhaps to recap, and I don't like to break the flow of the discussion, because I will not have time, and perhaps the rest of the discussion I'll take while I'm driving, which is dangerous, especially if you are not driving in the roads from Banha to Midghamr, but to in DC from Bethesda. But I'll have a few slides, if you don't mind, our excellent moderator, Dr. Galal, helped by Habiba, just to recap, and then I will suggest what's really happening. And I agree as well with Professor Bruni that yes, there are many technical discussions, but without the political leadership, nothing will happen. I still, in a discussion a couple of years ago with Anne Kruger, her 2001 proposal, I thought it would have been fantastic to have it and build on it rather than having nothing. I know that employers, including me so far at the IMF, are constrained, but let me just, out of honesty, the common framework is not functioning, and the sovereign roundtable is not functioning as well. So we don't really have a solution to the problem if we're leaving it to the G20 modalities. And I'll be super fast because we're all time constrained. And yes, Habiba, if you can just go into the second slide. And to your point, Dr. Galal about the stocks. This is not the first stock that have been accumulated, and based on the good work by Ayhan Koz and his team at the World Bank, we are in the fourth wave. The three waves, despite the fact that we're being reminded that if each time is different in details, but the accumulation of the waves or the accumulation of the stocks have been always the same. Countries desperate to grow had an opportunity borrowing at a lower cost, and then disruptions happen when interest rates get higher than the rates of growth. Typical, boring as it comes, from the first wave of Latin America and the Caribbean to the second wave that started in the 90s, didn't end until we are reminded with a third wave with a global scale, not just the borrowers of the emerging markets and developing economies do mistakes, but basically the gurus of the trade had the biggest mistake in recent history in the suboptimal borrowing associated with the mortgage crisis and all of that. And now we are in a fourth wave. And the bad thing that early warning indicators have been with us and people ignored it. And then we have those indicators mentioned just now by Professor Bruni. Next, please, Habiba. The issue here, and as mentioned by the minister, that our creditors are different. If we're checking what happened in the case of Egypt with its good restructuring, actually Egypt never defaulted since the problem that we had in the 19th century that ended up with the occupation of the country in 1882. So we learned the hard way. So we never defaulted, and we are proud of that. But that comes at a cost, as we know. But now, for those who are calling for better debt management, I'm all for it. But restructuring without really knowing who's your creditor, and it's good that the minister is reminding us that they are different today. Back in 2000, Paris Club was almost 40%. How much is Paris Club creditors today? Are less than 10%. The London Club is less than they used to be. IMF with the World Bank still at their old ratios, more or less, especially for countries like Egypt. But again, it's basically those that you cannot really deal with in the way that you dealt, say, during the Paris Club, World Bank, IMF deal of the early 1990s for Egypt. The incentives are different for them, and the way to convince them are very different. And some of them, actually, given the high rates of borrowing that many of our countries, including ours, in few years before the full maturity of the debt, they already got the principal, and very few is left of what is remaining. So they have no incentive to be paid back. And then, of course, there are the orphans and the widows could be behind some of these borrowing, if you consider that behind the bondholders are investors of pension schemes. And again, this is basically a super worrying figure, and that's why I mentioned during the El Masri Liyom discussion, and I mentioned that today, that I'm not just worried about those who are defaulting. I'm worried about those who are trying to avoid debt default by defaulting on everything else, especially the SDGs, the health, the education. Case in point, for countries that of their budget, they are spending on interest, not just on debt service, on interest, more than 50% of the budget. And that is coming from somewhere else. It's coming from what you spend on education and health. That's why we don't just we have two things. We have a silent debt crisis because the creditors are different and the creditors are fully provided for their loans and exposure. I encourage you to have a look at two important papers that came from the federal system. They are telling you that the American creditors and the European creditors, in terms of financial institutions, they are really in safe, dry ground because they have already made the provisions, and actually their exposure, direct and indirect, to developing economies and emerging markets is very, very small, not to be compared with the other three waves. So this is very much serious. So it's silent from the borrower side because Dr. Galal, you mentioned the creditors and the borrowers. The creditors are very much silent because they are fully provided for it. And the borrowers don't like even to send a signal that they need better debt management, let alone debt restructuring, because if they do that, our good three friends and their brothers, the rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, are going to be after them. So here, that's why it's silent, while everybody else is really suffering, is silent with suffering, because this is coming at a price. And I'm not talking about those cases of Chad, Zambia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, and Ghana, because they are more or less, as mentioned by Alex, we started to see some light at the end of a very long tunnel. But actually, this long tunnel is discouraging any country to go and say, well, let's do a debt resolution, debt restructuring mechanism, because they know very well that they are going to be stuck in tough negotiations of creditors' committees for 4 or 5 years. So again, technical solutions are there, but the political leadership is nil. It's not there. Nobody cares. So Mr. Plato I don't think that he will be dying in happiness now, because he assumed something worse than his nightmares. Next, please. But that could change, because there are some triggers that could really make the change, and we need to keep it technical, and we don't need really to go and knock on the leaders. I'm not seeing, with all love and appreciation to the current US Treasury, Professor Yellen, but Jim Baker was an exceptional leader, but he had the political support. I bet that Madam Yellen is no less of a leader than him, but without really the ecosystem supporting that, from the Congress to the administration, and the same for Europe. I'm not seeing anything coming as we have seen during Jim Baker's time, for instance. So we need to be realistic, keep it technical, and then push on the policy. And then there could be things that could be done with Minister Kojuk and his colleagues, perhaps, and I congratulate Dr. Abla for the Cairo Forum, perhaps a Cairo club that I'll discuss some details with him that could be useful, because this is going to be the thing that I'll be doing most of in the next 2 years as part of my work as a special envoy. I'm taking the responsibility in trying to provide technical solutions for that, and mobilizing political support, not necessarily at the G7 level or even the G20, but basically for countries that can really help themselves getting out from this crisis. Meanwhile, DSA is not really responding to matters that it should be responding to. The debt sustainability analysis, there are many question marks about how it should be reformed. Yes, we're dealing now with the joint work of the World Bank and the IMF and DSA. They are reconsidering some matters, which debt indicator that they should be using, considering local versus foreign currency debts, choosing the right discount rate and the DSAs, and dealing as well with problems of over-optimism or sometimes over-pessimism in what the DSAs can be doing. And actually, on these indicators, one of your friends, Dr. Galal, Larry Summers, challenged the use of debt indicator to be the debt to GDP. And he's encouraging everyone that please use more the indicator that Minister Koshuk mentioned. It's the debt service that matters, because debt as a flow GDP, to relate to it, how can you monetize it? How can you use it there? And there is a very lengthy paper by Professor by Larry Summers, who happens to be a professor as well, and Furman, who was an advisor and professor. They know what they are talking about from technical perspective and policy perspective. So we cannot really go and calm the politicians down and the leaders down. No, you are in the green zone, while another indicator, more critical, like the debt service, is not telling us that. And if we take as well how much you spend of your budget on debt service, we need to be careful about that. And this is all about the external debt. What about the domestic debt? And actually 30 years ago, in another, I'm appreciating the partnership with Konrad Adenauer, but with Friedrich Ebert, I suggested the establishment of a Cairo club that should take care as well of the domestic club. If that was when the time of Paris and London clubs were active, but domestic, that needs really to have some sort of solution, because people tend to take it for granted. It's not really as high politically in terms of its dangers, but actually everybody ends up paying for it, because we know how to pay for the domestic debt, more inflation. That's it. They call it nicely borrowing from the central bank, but there is no such a thing as borrowing. It's basically that you inflate the system to deal with the matter. Next, please. So yeah, I spoke about that during the previous slide, and actually there is an opportunity, because we know that policy rates are coming down with the Fed sending signals. But here, either you do it right or wrong. And I wrote actually 4 articles about that under the title of Life After Death. As an ancestor of the pharaohs, we are always concerned about what happened after death, but death is near death for some countries. So I say, well, there are solutions that we can deal with. There is the usual solutions: better management. Don't get the liquidity management problems to push you into insolvency matters. Actually, 2 of the 4 cases I mentioned of debt default had mismanaged their liquidity, and they pushed themselves into insolvency. But again, there are other things, including how not to get into that trap, because I know that some people celebrated the decline in the interest rates because that means another opportunity for them to knock on the international markets. I agree with Minister Kozhuk, that's not easy. You cannot sleep today indebted and then tomorrow you'll be in a safe horizon. No, but I think the opportunities could really be enhanced in order to do a better job in this. But as he said rightly, it should be a national priority, because not just about whatever he can do with the magicians of the Treasury of Egypt or with the central bank, they can solve this problem. It's basically about the growth model that we're using. And the issues that you started with, Dr. Galal, about this issue of savings or dissaving. And it's not just about the household sector, it's the fact that the private sector is not saving adequately and the government sector is not saving actually because of the losses that incurred in commercial and economic terms. We do not really have the kind of gross national saving that can enable us to grow without relying too much on foreign savers. Next, please. This is just, I'm attributing some of this discussion about the waves to important work that Ray Dalio have mentioned about these kind of short-term, long-term cycles, and actually this is a very lengthy discussion. And again, I'm happy to speak about it further if there are questions. But actually, 2 of the 4 articles I mentioned is basically about this issue of the short-term, long-term waves of debt. Next, please. Yeah, initiatives. Everybody and her sister and brother at the global system, they have initiatives. Of course, I work for as a special envoy to the Secretary General. There is an initiative based on the Sustainable Development Goals, how to finance it, stop the harm, debt management, debt restructuring, concessional finance, and then contingency funding. More details on that. Very much aligned with it is the Bridgetown initiatives. It has 10 points, very much assuming that the international financial system will be functioning better than this. Just out of being nice, there is another initiative compatible with the Bridgetown, led by the French president, the Paris Pact for People and the Planet, and it's linking the development finance problem, climate finance problem with the work that the Secretary General mentioned. And then we have another initiative, which is about the V20. This is the vulnerable 20 countries, and they are focusing on the more vulnerable low-income and middle-income countries. And then we have the Nairobi Declaration of September last year. And again, it's basically having an African focus. These are the politicians speaking based on technical discussions. And I was part of the many discussions in the kitchens of almost the 5 of them. But it needs this kind of political will. I see the political will coming from 2 unusual places, not from the White House, not from Brussels. I see that from 2 moral discussions. One, perhaps by the Pope, and I hope as well by the Imam, that the next year is going to be the Jubilee year. And there could be opportunities. And I agree with Alex, it's different from the days of HEPIC, but HEPIC was the highly indebted poor countries initiative was supported by the Pope and by the Pope then. And I think we can really benefit from that, because some of those creditors could listen to the Pope but may not listen to presidents, especially that they are not doing anything wrong, so the regulators cannot really penalize them. The other thing is the moral debt that Esther Duflo is saying that advanced economies, including the Europeans, responsible for the emissions. And actually, she made a nice calculation. I encourage you to have a look at her moral debt piece, that while developing economies are indebted to all of these countries and their companies and their financial institutions, but at the same time, the world owes these countries high emissions. If the whole countries of Africa are responsible for 3%, the advanced economies are responsible still for the majority of the emissions. And actually, 80% of the emissions are coming from the 20 countries of the G20. So here there could be some sort of an arrangement in this kind of a moral perspective. And finally, I'm dealing with the stock and the flow at the same time. If you can skip this one, because this one will capture it all, Habiba. Yes, it's about this development model and the growth model. As I was trying to say the other day, every country has a development model, including us, the beautiful 17 SDGs, the Ru'ya of Saudi Arabia on 2030, the 2030. Egypt has its own vision 2030. So all of that need a revision. And during the annual meeting, there will be many sessions about the new growth model: inclusive, green, competitive, digital transformation, support. And I encourage you again, please, to look at the piece by Mario Draghi in his competitiveness report and what types of investments are required in order to have an enhanced growth model. This is not just an African problem or an Egyptian problem. It's a global problem that we need a growth model adequately funded in order to deal with the issues of investment in human capital, in infrastructure, and in resilience. What to do then with all of that? And the minister and his colleagues would be very much involved in discussions and negotiations from now until June in the finance for development model, how to get the public, private, domestic, external finance supported by a better trade system with adequate debt management, with more support from the STI, science, technology, innovation, with better data system in order to feed better information to those who are modeling the growth and those who are investing in it. This is the big problem that should be starting with a resolution now, because countries cannot really wait for another 10 years, which is basically the lifetime of the new finance for development model to fix the debt problem that is getting the best out of their education, health, and their very livelihood. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Mahmoud, for a very comprehensive review of the issues. We have a little bit of a problem. And the problem is I cannot go through my second round. Otherwise, you guys are going to sleep here. So let me change course. One has to make adjustments, right? And that's a problem also when you have very good speakers. I am known for cutting people off when they talk too much. But I couldn't do it today because honestly, each one of them had something worthwhile to say. So I blame myself, not the IMF this time, for running out of time. And I'm going to handle it in a slightly different way. I'm going to ask one question, but I'm not going to ask them to answer my question. They are going to note it. And then I'm going to invite you to ask your questions. They're going to collect all the questions. And each of them is going to have 2 minutes, because I look at the watch here and I have 14 minutes. 14 and a half. All right. So my quick question is, especially my friend, I'm sorry I didn't want to be too hard on the IMF, but you know, you can't help it. The question is, Egypt borrowed from the IMF. The IMF came to Egypt a few times in the last few years. Last 10 years, maybe you came 3 times with 3 programs, and you keep coming back. I mean, don't you get tired? I think the issue really is, what is it? How do you make sure? I mean, if I were in your shoes, I would worry. I'm not talking about Egypt necessarily. I'm talking about, you know, in countries keep running into the same problems. Doesn't it make you wonder, what is it that I'm not doing right? That once I leave them, they go back to the old ways of doing things. And do I need to change? I am curious what your answer would be. But I think also, to be fair, it is not really an IMF question, because it is really governments. They're becoming, addicted. They like it's almost like you smoke marijuana. So you like them, you get used to them, you keep repeating it. The experience was so good, so why not do it again? So there is enough blame to go around, right? And comes our friend Bruni, who tells us you need a much better, it's a global public good, you need a better global governance sort of thing. The question for me is, why is it that we keep repeating the same mistake? Really? I mean, and it's not a question of who's to carry the blame. It's really a question of how do we make sure that we are not paying the price for the same problem too many times. That's my question, but that's only one. Now it's your turn. I have 12 minutes, 35 seconds, and I will start with you, Dr. Amah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed Galal. I will try to be quick as possible. Actually, I'm not an economist, but I'm a politician. And the problem of that, I guess we need first to identify that we had a problem with that because we used the loans in projects that are not paying in the short term. And we didn't see the ROI for the investments we had. And that's why we are having a lot of problem. And I'm worried that we will be repeating the mistakes again unless we admit that there was a mistake which is not happening in the government. This is the first thing. The second thing, why we are not joining the African countries who are asking for debt settlements for the political reasons and the economic issues in the global world and all these things, because if we join the efforts, I guess we can have some leverage and pressure on the creditors who are lending us and the problems we are having now. A small comment to Mr. Alex, to the IMF. I will not repeat what Dr. Galal said, but saying that
don't repeat.
Yeah, saying that you are the guardian of people. I don't think that IMF is the guardian of people by all means.
Thank you. Who else? Yes, sir. Over here.
أنا هتكلم بالعربي.
اتفضل.
في نفس البانل وزير المالية السابق قال احنا كنا في يوم من الأيام عاوزين نستلف 4 مليون دولار، فربنا كرمنا على آخر النهار قدرنا نستلف 20 مليار دولار. فده معناه ان الدوله ما عندهاش خطه لتحديد ووضع قواعد للاستدانه والتدقيق في الاستدانه لاقل حد ممكن، وما فيش اي التزامات في المستقبل لانك تقلل الاعتماد على الدين سواء الداخلي او الخارجي. لو في يا ريت تقول لنا ايه الخطه المستقبليه كده. الحاجه الثانيه، الصين يعني بتقتضي الديون بتاعتها من الدول المتعثره في شكل عقارات. روسيا ابتدت تقلل الاعتماد على الدولار بشكل كبير جدا. الدول العربية بتاخد عقارات من مصر بديلا عن الديون اللي لينا فيه. ايه خطة الدولة للاعتماد مستقبلا على تنويع محفظة الاحتياطي في البنك المركزي؟ شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا. Who else? Yes, sir. Over here.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أحمد الصافي. بحيي المنصة، بحيي معالي الوزير، والحقيقة هو قال كلمة جميلة قوي اللي هي فكرة إنه موارد مصلحة الضرائب والإصلاحات ما تتعمل هي أساسها بناء الثقة، وبناء الثقة دي هتجيب موارد كتير وده فعلا شيء أكيد. لكن اللي حابب حضرتك اللي أنا بسأل عنه هي الإصلاحات الضريبية دي ممكن تاخد وقت قد إيه؟ وممكن بناء الثقة دي تاخد برضه وقت قد إيه؟ وأثرها يبان على الممول إمتى؟ والحقيقه كمان احنا بطلب من حضرتك ان يكون في آلية للافكار، زي ما حضرتك قلت الافكار الابتكاريه والابداعيه، ان تكون في آلية حقيقيه من وزاره الماليه تقدر تروح بيها الافكار الابتكاريه والابداعيه وتحميها عشان تقدر تدرس ولعل يكون فيها شيء من عند اصحاب مصلحه. شكرا فندم.
شكرا جزيلا. Any other questions? One last question. Go ahead.
Mohammed Hanno, Chairman of Alexandria Business Association. His Excellency, the Minister, focused on growth and the importance of growth, but he didn't tell us how he would do that, except for, of course, we know that taxes is one of the tools that he can use.
Thank you very much. We have only 7 minutes, 45 seconds. So I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes, literally. And I'm going to start with Dr. Mahmoud because he is, I'm going to go in reverse order, if you don't mind. Dr. Mahmoud, the floor is yours. Unless you are in the car already.
I'm in the car. I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Go ahead. Can you drive and talk?
Yeah, well, I'm
Are
an
you sure?
Egyptian. I'm an Egyptian.
I usually don't talk to people who are driving, to tell you the truth.
No, it's on a speaker, so it's fine.
All right, go ahead.
All right. So just a quick response to the excellent comment by Dr. Maha. Joining others is not a bad idea, but every case is different. So far, WACO has a unified African position. And actually, in some of the aspects of the work, we could be doing well as well with countries from Latin America. So I will not limit it to Africa, but basically to see some, not just like-minded, but countries with the same position, because people are in fear. If they start to get together, this may already send some signals to rating agencies. And again, as much as some of our countries are dependent on the market, they don't need to send these signals. The second point, and very quickly, it's all about the growth model. And actually in Egypt, not beyond, a growth model that had been there, more thirsty for borrowing than private sector finance, than private sector investment, is under revision. This is basically what the current IMF program is about. This is basically what the Egyptian government has been saying. And it's all about monitoring that through the parliament, and needs to go beyond the transactions into seeing something that we can really consider as an economic policy for Egypt beyond the IMF program itself. So I will not believe it until I see this policy drafted. I will not believe the policy and its draft until I see it implemented. What we see is basically some signals in the right direction, on less dependence on debt instruments, more into the investment side. But a bigger job should be happening where the whole investment, where is it going to be coming from, which is the big question that we started. This was the first line mentioned by Dr. Galal. It's a savings problem more than an investment or a growth problem if we want really to have the funding problem resolved. And there is a domestic resource mobilization issue that needs to be resolved as well. So it starts and ends with the Minister of Finance again.
Thank you very much. Professor Bruni.
I have two very short considerations in answering your question to us. Well, one thing is we should enhance transparency of debt transactions. All details of debt agreements should be explained to the public, to the markets, and to the voters, so that they are aware of what is promised in exchange of debt. Costs and benefits of both debts and their repayment schedules should be clear to everybody. A second thing, but here I really go for dreams, is to reform the IMF. And here is where I see a role for Europe. The European Union has much more votes than it deserves, given its dimension, current dimension. It should offer these extra votes to China and the Global South, and with their alliance, reform deeply the IMF in many instances, because the IMF is a super precious box of brains and people, exceptionally useful for us economists in particular. But in order to have more political impact, it should become much more multilateral, much more independent of the United States, much more efficient from the point of view of taking decisions. So even the board should be changed, the way they take. But in order to do these reforms, we need to change first the voting powers, because if we keep the voting powers as they are, the US will never allow us to change the IMF and make it really efficient, because if it's efficient, its power will the power of the US will decrease. And they're not bad. I mean, the Americans are good and not bad. But when you have a power and you also have a big market, the market for dollars, that is your richness and your contribution to the world. Because, I mean, this is a service that the United States is providing to the world, the market for dollars. And you tend to be the boss. We have to take away some of the incentives they have to be too bossy.
Thank you very much indeed. Alex, floor is yours.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify that an
The
IMF
sound.
can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that an IMF supported program, and we call it IMF supported program. It's the program of the authorities, the IMF support. It's there to help the country. It's not designed to bail out creditors or to support a specific a ruling group of people. It's supposed to help the country stabilize its macroeconomic situation. That's what I meant in my initial comment, which was taken out of context. I think I agree with the comment that Professor Bruni made about the importance of reforming the IMF, also because the IMF is also a political institution. It reflects the votes of the memberships. And so it's important that countries that are becoming more important in the economic in the global economy acquire its proper voice. The third comment that I would make is that governments can make mistakes in the implementation of their economic programs, but the IMF also makes mistakes, and we have recognized some of these mistakes. We created an independent evaluation office. I started my career there, where we were looking at some of the mistakes that the IMF made in the Asian crisis and also in Argentina. And part of those evaluations are also to tell us, to the technical teams of the IMF, some of the aspects of the programs didn't work well because you neglected some social aspects of the programs. You were not looking at social spending. You are underestimating the impact of your policies on growth. And this also affected your legitimacy. And this is why sometimes we're not very popular. And the fourth comment, final comment I would make, is the importance of governments and strong institutions. There are countries that are making legitimate efforts to strengthen their institutions and increase transparency, and suffer external shocks that make their financial situation more difficult. And these countries deserve a special support. There are countries that get into problems with debt precisely because some of the projects didn't have a high rate of return, and there the conversation is going to be more difficult with the creditors. With that,
you did very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Manson.
I see zeros. So that's not bad.
No, it means that
Open-ended.
it's open-ended.
Yes.
Now you can talk for the next hour. It's okay.
I mean, it's very difficult to answer very complicated questions and complex ones in a very short period. So bear with me because I will be very also brief. We're all very tired, but that's exactly what I want to say. What is the mistake? Why this time can be done better? I would rephrase what the gentleman said, because I'm sure that there is a misinterpretation of what you meant. But if you want to borrow more, then how you can reduce the debt? I mean, this is the glimpse of what your question, I would say. That's why I'm starting the question by saying that for a debt to be sustainable and to be really dealt with and not to be repeated, it should be in national interest. It's not all that, because at the end of the day, it's not only about the project and the rate of return, because you can still borrow for health and education, and this have a social rate of return. But if it's a national level, then we should also not push so hard to overspend on other issues when we don't have the capacity to do it. So it has to be a national issue, not only at the Ministry of Finance level or the government level, but at the public level, at the political level, for everybody to know that if the private sector is coming for initiative, they must know that if you cannot have the money to support that, then we need to readjust together. It's not about asking and insisting on asking and leaving thinking that you gained at the expense of others. We need to have a credible thing. So it should be dealt at the national level, and it should be a national priority. And it means that there will be trade-offs and priorities, and that we should deal with that in a way that enable the country to deal with that. But this is number one. Number two, for this to be politically feasible, We need to again believe and really have the genuine understanding that private sector need to play a bigger role. It need to play a bigger role. It need to play a bigger role. It need to play a bigger role, and we need all to help in that. And this should be genuine belief. The more they can do, of course, in a competitive environment, in an environment that can be also very transparent, the better. The best thing for a government is to get its share in the taxes, not what happened in the past that we don't give a very big role for the private sector and we do something else. We give them too much tax incentives, which is the worst situation. So you don't get a collection of your revenues and you give a lower share. What we need to do is to give them a very big share and actually to get the normal return, which is a tax share from their profits. Our role is to make them make more profits and for us to get our share. This is the balanced way. If we have this balance, then it's a much easier solution. So I think we need to focus on those two things. How to make this a national priority, how to give the private sector a bigger role, then how to get our also decent share from their profits by having to collect our taxes in a very efficient and simple way. This year we'll be implementing what we have announced fully. We're hoping that this will be, will show the example that by doing the right things, this is the debate always, that tax administration can be seen by a lot of institutions that this is not of significance. I think it can be of huge significance, equally as a policy reforms, and I'm betting on that. I hope that I don't lose at the end, but it's a risk. It's a risk. Of course, we'll be doing all the effort to make it succeed because the symbol of it is important. Trust is important. By building trust and having everybody contributing is very important. The gains of it is much bigger than numbers here or there. So I'm hoping that we'll win at the end of the year. I'm hoping for that.
Wonderful. I'm going to summarize everything that has been said tonight and hope with me. Of course not. I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you. You have been wonderful audience and they have been wonderful panelists. Thank you all very much.